All right, well, let me encourage you to find Obadiah. That would be the challenge of the night. It is a tiny one-chapter book stuck in the middle between a bunch of big books. And it's in a section of the Bible we hardly ever go to. And as you find your way, let me just encourage you. I know these studies are not that easy. The one single thing we're going to focus on tonight, and you see that we've only planned to cover one verse. We'll see how that goes. These are difficult things, and the thing we're going to study tonight, it's a humiliating thing, not even a humbling thing, but a humiliating reality. And yet, in order for us to really understand the prophets as we approach them, we really have to understand this concept. So we'll talk about it in a moment. But let me just kind of remind us of where we're at so far. So Obadiah is one of the writing prophets in the Old Testament. He's one of 16 of them. If you were to look in your table of contents, the first of them in your Bible would be Isaiah. And then from Isaiah all the way to Malachi in your Old Testament are the writing prophets. And if you counted those books, you'd see there were 17. But I just told you there were 16. So who are you going to believe, me or the table of contents? The Book of Lamentations is not a prophet. It is written by one of the prophets, but it's actually poetry. So we've surveyed Lamentations a long time ago. So 16 of those men were writing prophets, and 4 of them wrote really long prophecies. 12 of them wrote relatively short prophecies, and this book we're studying, Obadiah, is one of those. He's relatively short. In fact, he's the shortest book in the entire Old Testament. But what we've covered so far in Obadiah, he's kind of a strange prophet, because most of the Old Testament writing prophets were sent to the nation of Israel. And they will tell us whether they were sent to the northern part of the nation, which was called Israel, or to the southern part of the nation, which was called Judah. In Obadiah's case, he doesn't tell us, and so we use internal evidence and we conclude that he's writing to the southern part of the kingdom. He's writing to Judah. But the message is not about Judah at all, which makes him kind of stick out. He's kind of a black sheep among the prophets because he's writing about a foreign nation called Edom. We're going to talk in some depth tonight about who Edom is and where they come from. What we've covered so far in the first 9 verses of this strange little prophecy is a categoric and systematic statement of destruction, absolute total destruction, that God is threatening and promising to unleash on this ancient nation of Edom. And so you see in verse 1, we're introduced to the book with these words, "The vision of Obadiah, thus says Adonai Yahweh concerning Edom. We've heard a report from Yahweh, and an envoy has been sent among the nations, saying, 'Arise and let's go against her for battle.'" And then Yahweh begins to unleash this devastation. And in verses 2 through 4, Yahweh directs a response to the arrogant challenge of the proud Edomites, where they say, at the end of verse 3, "Who will bring me down to earth?" Yahweh's answer to that is in verse 4, "Though you build high like the eagle and set your nest among the stars, from there I will bring you down." And then from verse 5 to 9, he begins to systematically explain how he's going to bring this judgment to pass. And of course, we see that he's going to use other nations to accomplish it. But we're not to be mistaken that even though he's using the hand of other nations, it's Yahweh himself bringing the destruction. And so in verse 5 and 6 and 7 and 8 and 9, as he unfolds this, he talks about how he's going to destroy their economic prosperity. He's also going to destroy their diplomatic ability. He's going to destroy their ability to gather intelligence and use that as a defense. And then he's going to destroy their military power. And the result of that is going to be a complete annihilation of the nation. That's where we've come. Now, just 3 things I want you briefly to note about that. First of all, that it is at the time that this was given, that this statement of judgment coming, at the time that Obadiah said it, it had not happened yet. It was yet future. So in that sense, it's future prophecy when it was given. Now, it's not future now. The destruction of Edom, in the sense that he mentions it here, has already been done. It's already been accomplished. Okay, we'll talk a little bit about that tonight. When we get to verses 15 and 16, we're going to see that the future day of the Lord will be the final judgment of these nations, not just Edom, but all nations. And that is yet in our future. Okay, so we'll have more to say about that in a couple of weeks. The second thing I want you to notice is how complete this devastation is. I mean, the contrast that Yahweh is drawing in this is if this was mere human interaction, there would still be something left over. There would be a remnant preserved of the Edomites. But in Yahweh's hands, this will be a complete and total annihilation. And then the last thing is it seems kind of random, doesn't it? Now, we've talked in introduction kind of stuff. We've talked about what it was that Edom did that led Yahweh to level this destruction against them. But we've covered it in preview because we haven't actually seen it in the text of Obadiah yet. What does Obadiah say is the reason? And so until you come to those verses that he explains that, it kind of can seem like, well, this is a little bit harsh. It's a bit of an overreaction, almost like a divine temper tantrum. Like, what did they do that made God so angry that he thought he had to level them? We're going to see some of that tonight. The section we are beginning tonight occupies a paragraph in Obadiah's poetic text. That paragraph in your text runs from verses 10 down through verse 14. Now, I just want to remind you, chapters and verses, two separate things. I did know that. They are added much later. So the text as Obadiah wrote this, and any of the scripture, the New Testament, the Old Testament, any of it, those chapter markings, those verse markings are arbitrary. They were added much, much later. They are not useful for you if you're going to study the text. They're not useful for you in dividing the writer's actual flow of thought. In fact, sometimes they make that harder to do. How they're useful is if you remember that the writer said this, but you can't remember exactly where he said it. They're useful as place markers, like points on a map to help you get where you're going. So as you look at the text yourself, and we've entered into covenant together to study pieces of the scripture together, ignore those chapter and verse markings when it comes to determining what the writer's flow of thought was. Okay, what you really want to look at is paragraph divisions, sentence divisions. Look for periods, commas, things that help you break up the writer's grammatical flow of thought, and that will be more helpful. But the section we're looking at is a paragraph, verse 10 through verse 14. Now, if I talk fast and your ears listen fast, we will get through a whopping one verse tonight. We're going to look at verse 10. The reason we're going to take only one verse tonight, okay, is because the subject that this one verse brings up to us is a subject we have to give attention to. We have to understand what this concept is because it is absolutely vital as we move into a study of the Old Testament prophets. This is a thing they all address, and you have to understand it. And so since we're starting at the earliest of these prophets, it makes sense to hit it now. Okay. So tonight I want to break this study up into three parts. The first part, we're going to look at this verse 10, and we'll break it up like I always do. We'll go a piece at a time, and we'll see what it says. Okay. The second part of the study, we're going to look at this verse 10 mentions Esau's brother Jacob, and that tells us that there's a relationship between these two nations, Edom and Israel. So we're going to talk about that relationship, who these two men were, where they came from, and the nations that came from them, and the interaction those nations have had. That'll be the second part of our study. The third part, we're going to talk about, this has been an unleashing of judgment on this nation. What gives God the right to judge? What makes him think that he has the right to judge anybody? We're going to talk, that sounds blasphemous, but I promise we'll handle that tonight. Okay. So let's look at the text. And for the sake of time, I won't read you the entire paragraph, although you can read it on your own. Also, on the website, if you're ever interested, if you go to the page where I have the studies from Obadiah, the first link at the very top of that page, you can listen to a narration of the book of Obadiah. That way you don't have to read through it every day. If you want to just listen to it, and then it's in your mind, the text is there. So that's there. All right, let me read verse 10 to you. Coming on the heels of everything that happened in the first 9 verses, this is what Obadiah says. Because of violence to your brother Jacob, you will be covered with shame, and you will be cut off forever. All right, so we jump right into this concept that we got to talk about that is so vital to the rest of Old Testament prophecy is right here in the first 2 words, because of. Now that seems like a something you would just say in passing. But when the Old Testament prophet Obadiah says because of, he's drawing your attention to something here. And the principle that we derive from this is called, are you ready for this? Remember this. This is a foot stomper. Remember this. Retributive justice. Remember that. Retributive justice. This is the concept of retributive justice. That when God decides that he is going to unleash judgment, that he is going to level a destruction against a person or against a national entity, he is not just unnecessarily vitriolic. He is not capricious. He is not malicious in his heart. He is not a mean kid with a magnifying glass trying to pull the feelers off of an ant. That's not the way that God operates. When he levels a destruction, it is because that destruction has been warranted. He does it for a reason. The object of his destruction earned it, thoroughly earned it. Okay? So, before we dive into this concept too deeply, let me say this. You would say, as you experience your life and as you see the lives of people around you, it would be fair, right? It would be nice for us to live in a world where we could say, good things always happen to good people, and bad things always happen to bad people. And that would make sense to us. That would make sense in our minds. And as you study a concept like retributive justice, you are struck with the idea that Galatians 6 says that do not be deceived, God is not mocked. We'll talk about the verse in a moment. Whatever a man sows, that he will also reap. Well, if that is across the board true, that means that good people get good things and bad people get bad things, and that just makes sense. But that isn't the way we see the world around us playing out. That isn't the way we experience our own lives. And no matter whether you consider yourself a good person or a bad person, whatever you feel in your heart about yourself, you would have to say that you don't always feel like you get what you deserve. And whether that's a good thing, because I deserve wrath and destruction and God has been good to me and hasn't given that to me, or whether that's a bad thing because I work so hard and I do all the right things and yet my life is a shambles. And you look at a man like Job, who by God's own testimony, he was the most righteous man alive at the time. And yet he lost his children. He lost all of his wealth. He lost his health. He lost his emotional support when his wife told him, just curse God and die. And then his friends, who should have been his emotional support, came, and he was literally alone. And so through none of that did he sin. He didn't earn any of that. And so it'd be easy for us to say, well, the concept of retributive justice is a false concept. It's a false notion. The fact that people get what they deserve, they reap what they sow, God is always just, that's a false concept. Except that it's not. It's not. What I see with these I don't know, futile eyes, what I see is what's right before me. What God sees is everything. And so even though what I see in front of me may not seem like justice, God promises that he is going to work this out. And that means that there is a coming day, and I might have to wait for it. I might have to wait for that justice. I might have to wait for that judgment. But the message, hear me clearly, the message of Obadiah is at its heart a message of vindication, not a message of judgment. Are you hearing that? It is judgment against Edom, but it's vindication. It was about Edom, but it wasn't to Edom. It was to Israel. It was God telling them that you are my people. And even though you may not see this justice working itself out right now, and think of what these Jews went through by the time that they were done being a nation. They saw their own women eating their children. They saw their city burned down. They saw their temple that had stood for 400 or 500 years broken down. And so their life came to an end. Now think about, we think just history, just a thing that happened. But think about how that would be in our city. If we couldn't walk down the street without seeing houses burned to rubble around us, children lying dead in the streets being slaughtered by some kind of an invading army, women who were so hungry that they literally ate their babies, and you'd say that's atrocious. And we think that the world we live in is so crazy. It is, but it's always been crazy. And the point is, as we go through these things, we don't lose sight of the fact that God promises to work out things for good to those who love him. It's a good thing that retributive justice is not a hard and fast rule, because the book of James says that mercy triumphs over judgment. And I can't speak for all of you, but I need the mercy, so I'll take it every time. But let's talk about this retributive justice. So come to the book of Romans, and if you don't want to have to find your way, well, you know what? We're done in Obadiah for now, so you can lose your way in Obadiah. Well, no, keep something in it after you've flipped over it, because we got to come back. Sorry, I love to watch you flip. As you scratch your head, I clap my hands. It makes me happy. But Romans chapter 1, and we're going to try and move pretty quickly through this. I never move quickly through anything. You know that well enough by now. Romans chapter 1 is a definition of wrath coming on the unbeliever. And you see how he begins, Romans chapter 1, verse 18. The wrath of God is revealed from heaven. Now, I'm not going to read you this whole section. It goes from the end of the chapter. But I want you to note two things. First of all, how it begins, and second of all, how it ends. The wrath of God is revealed from heaven against what? What do you see there? And unrighteousness. The wrath of God is revealed from heaven against everybody all the time. No. Unrighteousness, ungodliness. So even though you could say that bad things happen to good people, that is true. In a fallen world, that is bound to happen. But the wrath of God is unleashed upon those who deserve it, those who demonstrate in their hearts they are unrighteous, they are unrepentant, they are ungodly. He's not capricious, he's not mean-spirited, trying to see who he could hurt and how bad he can make them hurt. And then look at the very end of this, the very end of the paragraph. So he gives, not the paragraph, the chapter, he gives a statement of all these ways that unbelief manifests itself. Let me just read you part of this, right? In verse 29. They're filled with all unrighteousness, wickedness, greed, evil, full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, malice, gossips, slanderers, haters of God, insolent, arrogant, boastful, inventors of evil, disobedient to parents, without understanding, untrustworthy, unloving, unmerciful. These are the kind of people I want to hang out with. Well, I hate to tell you that, but these are the kind of people I am. So I need God's mercy. And although they know the ordinance of God, you see that? The people who are doing all these things know the ordinance of God. What is the ordinance of God? Here it is. That those who practice such things are worthy of death. Even though they know that, they not only do these things, but they give hearty approval to those who practice them. You see the word know there. The unbelieving world around you, when they are judged by God, does not, in their inward heart of hearts, think this is not fair. They know the ordinance of God, that those who practice such things are worthy of death. So it is not ignorance that makes them sin. It's arrogance, not ignorance. Okay? They know and they don't care. And then in chapter 2, look what he says. So you have no excuse. Not them, but you have no excuse. Every one of you who passes judgment, because in that which you judge another, you condemn yourself, for you who judge practice the same things. We're not going to get into all of that, but look at verse 2. And we know that the judgment of God rightly falls upon those who practice such things. We know that when God judges, it is rightly that he judges. That judgment rightly falls on those who practice such things. That is the concept of retributive justice. God is not a mean kid with a magnifying glass. And when he pours out justice, he does it because those people on whom he pours out that judgment deserve it. They're worthy of death. And if you go, for example, at the end of Revelation, as God comes and the picture is that God slays them so that the blood of the slain reaches up to the horse's bridle, and then he gives them blood to drink as he defiles the water, the fresh water, so they can't have any fresh water to drink, and all these horrible things being unleashed on the world. And you know what the saints are saying as they observe this from heaven? It's good that you gave them blood to drink. They deserve it. Retributive justice. Those who are judged are not judged capriciously. They've earned thoroughly what they've done. So that's in Romans. Well, since you're in chapter 2, I mentioned verse 6 also. As God brings judgment, at the end of verse 5, it's the righteous judgment of God who will render to each person according to his deeds. You see, again, the point is, and in that statement, the Apostle Paul is quoting from King David in the Psalms, where he makes the same basic statement. So when God judges, he does it according to your deeds. So the basic principle is that apart from God's mercy, you get what you deserve and you deserve what you get. That's the basic principle, okay, apart from God's mercy. So then come over to chapter 3 of Romans. And for the sake of moving along through this passage, I'm going to ignore some of the context, but I want you at some point, if you have interest, I've given you the notes, you go back and look at this. But we'll pick up in verse 5, just so you can see the statement. He begins verse 5 by saying this: if our unrighteousness demonstrates the righteousness of God, what shall we say? Okay, now we won't get into his argument, what kind of logical point he's trying to make here, but look where he goes with it. The God who inflicts wrath is not unrighteous, is he? He's not unfair when he inflicts wrath, is he? I'm speaking in human terms. May it never be. Me gnoita, that thought is inconceivable. For otherwise, how will God judge the world? If God, in judging the world, is unrighteous, how can he presume to judge unrighteousness if he's unrighteous in doing it? And we'll talk. That gives us the basis for the concept, the question that we're going to ask in a little bit here. What gives God the right to judge? Well, that's the first thing. He's perfectly righteous. He's perfectly righteous. He is the standard. So he has the right to judge unrighteousness because there's no unrighteousness in him. We'll talk about that when we get there. Okay, so I do want you to see this since you're in Romans. Flip past Romans, 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, come to Galatians. Galatians chapter 6, the last chapter of Galatians. I've made reference to this verse before, but this is the principle of retributive justice basically categorized for you. Galatians chapter 6. Okay, audience participation here. Somebody read loudly for me so I can hear it. Read verse 7 to me. Okay, now, as you look at the world around you, that statement does not seem right at all. The first part of that statement, God is not mocked. Is that right? Look around. Do you see God mocked? Absolutely. Absolutely. He's mocked on every front. His laws are spurned in every arena. His counsel is ignored by everybody in every state of life. He is mocked, except that this text tells us very clearly he is not. So how do we reconcile that? Here it is. No man can pull the wool over God's eyes. No man will have the last laugh. You may think that you stand in defiance of God and his word, but at some point you are going to bend the knee and God is not mocked. And at that point, you will have wished that back when you had the opportunity, you bent the knee willingly, because you will not be bending the knee at that moment to a merciful God, but to one who is not mocked, because what you sowed is what you are now reaping. Understand the serious business. Serious business. Okay. So, that is the principle. God is not mocked. Sinful people will not have the last laugh. Arrogant nations will not have the final say. Deceitful people will not be allowed to continue in the lie indefinitely. God is not mocked. And whatever you put in the ground, that's what will come up. Now, obviously, that principle is true in the unbelieving world, but you know that Paul didn't write this to unbelievers. He wrote this to the churches of the region of southern Galatia. Look what he says next. God is not mocked. Whatever a man sows, this he will also reap. The one who sows to his own flesh will from the flesh reap corruption. He's writing to the church. As a believer, you have a choice how you are going to walk. If you walk according to the flesh, you will reap corruption. All right, I don't have time to spend a lot more time on that. Maybe next week we can spend some more time on it. Okay, we'll see how it goes. Come back to Obadiah if you can find your way back. So in verse 10, because of what? What is the thing that God is unleashing retributive justice upon Edom for? Because of violence to your brother Jacob. Violence there is, it seems like a weak word, violence. But just so you're aware, in Genesis 6, right before God unleashes the flood that destroys over 1 billion people and only 8 are saved through it, God says through the mouth of Moses, as he writes in Genesis, that God saw at that moment that the earth was filled with violence. And the consequence of the filling of the earth with violence is that every intent of the thought of man's heart was only evil continually. Just be aware this is a strong Hebrew word. Sometimes the English translations have a hard time conveying the weight of a word in Hebrew. This is a strong word because of violence. It's not like they just slapped Jacob in passing. Okay, what Esau did to his brother Jacob was heinously violent, okay, grossly against God's intent. To who? To your brother Jacob. We have to spend just a little bit of time on this. Remember that in Genesis 4, we have the account of the first murder in the Bible, Cain and Abel. They were brothers. Now, I'm not going to take you back there because we've been there just in a recent study. But remember that when Cain executed, when he murdered Abel, when God accosted Cain for it, he asked Cain, "Where is Abel your brother?" And what was Cain's response? "Am I my brother's keeper?" And if you remember when we looked at that passage not so long ago, that's the exact same word that Moses used to describe to us Abel. He was a keeper of the flocks. What is a keeper of the flocks to do? What does the word mean? He provides for them. He protects them. You've seen shepherds go out there and literally kill bears and lions to protect their flock. So you understand that the job of the shepherd is to protect and to provide for his flock. Cain understands that his role as the brother of Abel, his role as the older brother is to protect his brother, is to provide for his brother. And instead he murders him. Okay. Now, this is a violation of God's intent, and I'm not going to take you to a lot of these passages because I want to move on. The consistent testimony of the Scripture is that there is to be an intimacy between brothers. Not all brothers are blood brothers, just so you know. Okay. So, not all family is blood relation. But there is to be that relationship of care and concern and protection, okay, among brothers. That's what it's supposed to be. You might be interested to know that the passage we just looked at in Romans chapter 1, in the list of ungodly behavior that Paul gives, one of the words he uses is unloving. That same Greek word, astorges, is used again in 2 Timothy in another list of ungodly behavior. It's an interesting word, unloving. Because as we know, Greek, the language the New Testament was written in, Greek has a lot of words that mean love. There's eros, which is the erotic love between a man and his wife. There's phileo, which is the companionship love between brothers. There's agape, which is self-sacrificing love. This is none of those. And this particular word, astorges, the word is storges. It's never used in the New Testament without the a on front. When you put the alpha, a, on the front of a Greek word, you negate it. Okay, it's like a not. That's what the a is. So storges is a certain kind of love, but it's never used in the New Testament. It's always astorges, not that kind of loving. Storges is when you see a little brother fall down and scrape his knee, and the big brother comes behind and picks him up and dusts him off. That's storges. When you see a child with a broken heart for whatever reason, and the parent come along and hold them and love them, that's storges. That's the storges love. Twice in Romans and in 2 Timothy, Paul tells us that one characteristic of the unbelieving world is they are astorges. The breakdown of the family unit is not God's intent. It is not God's intent. The unit was built by God to be something special. Now listen, the family you are born with is not necessarily the family you have, right? We understand in a fallen world that's the way it is. But God has brought us together, right? We're a family. We love each other. We take care of each other. We provide and protect each other. That's the way it's to be. And so in Obadiah, when God levels against this nation Edom the charge that because of violence to your brother Jacob, and he referenced the name of the man, not the nation that came from him, not your brother Israel, your brother Jacob, the man Jacob, violence that you did to him, that man. And he's drawing attention to the relationship that Esau and Jacob should have had. The familiarity of protection and provision and the love they share, the companionship they share, that's what they should have had. And they didn't. We'll look at that in a moment. So because of violence to your brother Jacob, what's going to happen? Two things. First of all, you're going to be covered with shame. And second, you're going to be cut off forever. These are difficult things to grapple with. Remember that at the beginning of this section, in verse 2, God says to Edom, I will make you small among the nations, you are greatly despised. Because in verse 3, the arrogance of your heart has deceived you. So you're arrogant, but I'm going to make you small. And this is another statement of that. You're going to be covered with shame. The word covered there in Hebrew just means to be clothed with. Literally, so when you walk down the street, hopefully, if you don't want to go to jail, hopefully you're wearing clothing. You walk down the street, the first thing that people see when they see you is how you're dressed, right? In fact, we even say, right, clothes make the man. The first impression they have of you is what they see on the outside, right? What God is saying here by using this word clothed, with covered with shame, is that when Edom presents themselves to the nations, the first thing the nations are going to see is, man, that's embarrassing. They're clothed with it. They can't even hide it. They can't hide their shame. It's right out there for everybody to see. It's the first thing people will notice about them when they think of Edom, is the shame that Edom is involved with now. The last part of that is, you will be cut off forever. Of course, we've talked about the Hebrew expression cut off. It means exterminated, killed. It's not a pretty picture. Okay, this is the second time in just a couple of verses that Hebrew verb is used. Look at verse 9. So that everyone may be cut off from the mountain of Esau by slaughter. Do you remember when we talked about that word, when we come across it the first time? What the word actually means? It means to be exterminated, to be executed, without regard for the sanctity of your life. Exterminated like a pest. I think I used the example, if you see a spider crawling across the floor, you don't think to yourself before you stomp on it, well, shoot, man, that spider probably has a family. It's probably got hopes and dreams. I probably shouldn't stomp on that. I should probably shoo it away and help it along its way. It's beneath you. You just step on it. You don't give consideration. That's what the word cut off means here. It means to exterminate like it was a pest, like there's no regard for its life, for any of its affairs. In other words, Edom says, well, you can't destroy me. I got all these things going on. And God said, I don't care about that. That stuff's nothing to me. He steps on him. That's it. Okay. So that's the verse. Have we had enough of Obadiah? Can we move on now? Okay. So now let's talk about this relationship between Jacob and Esau. This is a central theme in the book of Obadiah. So come back to Genesis and let's do a little background. And I'll try to rip through this. I'm aware that some of this may be a little bit, arduous, but it is what it is. Genesis 25. I could have told you where you were going, but I like to keep you guessing. Actually, I just don't want you to get there before I do. Genesis 25. All right, so Abraham, the progenitor of the Hebrews, of the nation of Israel. Promises are made to him. Those promises are to be given to him through a son, Isaac. But he has a son before that, Ishmael. Those sons don't come through Ishmael, only through Isaac. Isaac then is given the promises all over again. God reiterates those same covenant promises to Isaac. And now Isaac is going to have some sons, and the promises have to be passed on through those sons. And this is the account we pick up in chapter 25. Look at verse 19. These are the records of the generations of Isaac, Abraham's son. Abraham became the father of Isaac, and Isaac was 40 years old when he took Rebekah, the daughter of Bethuel the Aramean of Padan Aram, the sister of Laban the Aramean, to be his wife. Isaac prayed to Yahweh on behalf of his wife because she was barren, and Yahweh answered him, and Rebekah, his wife, conceived. Happy days, she has a baby. Not so happy days, she has two. And they don't like each other. They don't even like each other when they're in the womb together. Verse 22, the children struggled together within her. The word in Hebrew means to strive. This is not the normal movement of babies in the belly. These two kids are in there pulling each other's hair, kicking each other, pushing each other, pinching each other. They don't like each other, even in the womb. In fact, as we read further in the narrative, Esau is the oldest. I mean, they're twins, but he comes out first. And when they get him out, what's attached to his little heel? His brother's hand. His brother trying to pull him back in. No, I want to come out first. So these two brothers don't even like each other in the womb. Okay, so let's keep reading. Verse 22, the children struggled together within her, and she said, if it is so, why then am I this way? So she went to inquire of Yahweh, and Yahweh said to her, pay careful attention here, 2 nations are in your womb. Not 2 boys, 2 nations. 2 peoples, not 2 people, 2 peoples will be separated from your body. You see, they will be separated. They will be separated from your body. 1 people shall be stronger than the other. The older will serve the younger. Well, now, what does that tell you about everything that follows? You don't know what all follows yet, but you will when we're done. God had already ordained this. Okay? This was already ordained from the beginning. The promises were not going to come through Esau. God had already chosen Jacob to rename him Israel, and the promises would come through him. So, what happens? When her days to be delivered, verse 24, were fulfilled, behold, there were twins in her womb. Now the first came forth red, all over like a hairy garment. Nothing wrong with that. And they named him Esau. Afterward, his brother came forth with his hand holding on to Esau's heel, so his name was called Jacob, and Isaac was 60 years old when she gave birth to them. All right, let's keep reading just for the sake of figuring out what happens next. When the boys grew up, Esau was a skillful hunter, a man of the field, but Jacob was a peaceful man, living in tents. Now Isaac loved Esau because he had a taste for game, but Rebekah loved Jacob. When Jacob had cooked stew, Esau came in from the field, and he was famished. Esau said to Jacob, please let me have a swallow of that red stuff there, for I'm famished. Therefore his name was called Edom. Remember that. The word Edom means red. This boy's name, the name of the nation that will come from him, is red. This is not a happy name. This is hearkening back every time somebody says the name of the nation. It's hearkening back to the time when he literally sold his birthright for a cup of stew. Okay, when his brother worked to steal his birthright. Okay, it's an offensive name, but it is what it is. But Jacob said, first sell me your birthright. And Esau said, behold, I'm about to die. So what use then is the birthright to me? And Jacob said, swear to me. So he swore to him and sold his birthright to Jacob. And Jacob gave Esau bread and lentil stew, and he ate and drank and rose and went on his way. So Esau despised his birthright. Okay, move to chapter 27. Years pass. Isaac is old now. The dad is old. And he's blind. He can't see. He realizes he's about to die, so he's got to give the blessing. He's got to pass the blessing on, and he fully intends to give the blessing to Esau, the oldest, for 2 reasons. First of all, we've already read in chapter 25, he loves Esau better than he loves Jacob. Second reason, he does not realize that God has already told Rebekah that the older is going to serve the younger, not the other way around, not the normal way, okay? He doesn't know that. God didn't say that to him. He said that to Rebekah. Okay, so here's what happens. He called his older son Esau and said to him, my son. And he said to him, here I am. And Isaac said, behold, I'm old, and I don't know the day of my death. So take your gear and your quiver, go out to the field, hunt game for me, prepare a savory dish for me, such as I love. Bring it to me that I may eat, so that my soul may bless you before I die. So I'm going to summarize some of this story so I don't have to spend all my night reading, okay? What happens? Esau goes out into the field to hunt game so that he can make that savory food that Dad loves so much. He's going to prepare it. He's going to bring it. Isaac's going to eat the food. They're going to have a little ceremony. He's going to put his hands on Esau. He's going to bless him and give him the promise. But that isn't God's plan. Now, unfortunately, Rebekah, the boy's mother, thinks she has to be deceitful in order for what God promised to actually come to pass. We know that God would have worked it out if she had not been deceitful. But she was, so it is what it is. So here's what Rebekah does. She already knows what God has said. It's not going to be Esau. The promises are coming through. And secondly, she loves Jacob better than she likes Esau. So you don't care that Esau's the older. She's going to do what she has to do to make this work out so that Jacob gets the blessing, gets the inheritance and the birthright. So here's what she does. She tells Jacob, I'll make the food. I know what kind of food your dad likes. I'll make it. While Esau's off there hunting, I'll make some that we already have. You go in and feed it to him. He's blind. He won't know the difference. He'll give you the blessing. And Jacob says, well, listen, Esau's a hairy beast, and I'm smooth. So this is not going to work. He might not be able to see, but he can still feel. So she takes hairy garments made of goat's hair and covers him with them so that when he goes in, if Isaac happens to feel him, he'll say, oh, he's hairy. He must be Esau. Okay, it's a deceptive thing all the way around. What is the result of this? Isaac is deceived, so he gives the blessing to Jacob. Happy days. except that as Jacob walks out of the tent, Esau walks in and says, I'm here. I got the food. You can bless me now. And Isaac, the text tells us he trembled violently. Then you can see him go, What? You were already here. I already blessed you. And Esau said, You didn't bless me. He finds out that he's been deceived. Esau finds out that his brother has been deceitful, whatever, deceptive. Esau is so angry that the only reason he lets Jacob live is because he doesn't want to break his father's heart. But he knows Dad's going to die soon, and his plan is, as soon as Dad dies, I'm going to kill that traitorous jerk. I'm going to kill my brother. Well, Rebecca, Mom, hears, and so she tells Jacob, you got to go. You got to run for your life. And that starts this whole thing. Now, Jacob is gone for at least 20 years. Maybe 40, depending on how you read the account and how you do the chronology. He's gone for a long time, decades, and finally comes back, and there is some sort of a reconciliation. But what happens then? Come over to chapter, on your way to chapter 36, stop in chapter 32. In chapter 32, Jacob's on his way back, from Laban's house. He's on his way back to be reunited with Esau. The night before he comes across Esau, he has an interesting encounter with, it just tells us, a man. A man wrestled with him till daybreak. We know that this man was an incarnation of God himself. But they wrestle. Jacob wins the wrestling match against God. And in verse 28, God says to him, Your name shall no longer be Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and men and have prevailed. And if you're interested to know, Israel means in Hebrew, he wrestles with God. That's what the word means. That's what the name means. So now we know that Jacob, his name now is Israel. So the nation that comes from him will be the nation of Israel. I just brought you there so you could see that. Okay, so in chapter 36, the boys are now reunited. They're old men. They're reunited, but they have so much stuff between them, so much livestock, so many possessions, that Canaan can't hold them both. The land that they were promised, it can't hold them both. And so in verse 6 of chapter 36, Esau took his wives and his sons and his daughters and all his household and his livestock and all his cattle and all the goods which he had acquired in the land of Canaan and went to another land, away from his brother Jacob. You remember the promise that God made to Rebekah? Two peoples will be separated from your womb. That's what she's saying, right? That's what is happening right here. They're being separated. Esau goes down south and east, to Seir. So verse 7, their property had become too great for them to live together. The land where they sojourned could not sustain them because of their livestock. So Esau lived in the hill country of Seir. Esau is Edom. Chapter 36 gives us all his descendants and that. But then in verse 1 of chapter 37, Jacob lived in the land where his father had sojourned, in the land of Canaan. So you have two nations now, Jacob living in Canaan, Israel, Esau living in Seir. We don't really know what happens to the nation of Edom. The text of the Old Testament is not really concerned to tell us their history, although they do come up relatively frequently in the record of Israel's history. The account tells us what happens to Israel, and so we know that they end up in Egypt. And if you're interested to know how they got there, how they became slaves there, you could read the account for yourself. But suffice it to say, they end up in Egypt, and they're there for 430 years. I want you to understand that for 430 years, they are slaves in Egypt, while for 430 years, Esau is growing as a nation. They're establishing themselves in that land as a nation. To give you an idea of 430 years, the Civil War, that was a long time ago, right? That happened about 160 years ago. The Revolutionary War, that was a really long time ago. That happened about 250 years ago. We have been a nation since 1776, so about 250 years. How far back is 430 years? That's a long way back. Well, let me give you some things. That would take you to about 1591, Here's what was happening in 1591. That's 30 years before Plymouth was settled by the Pilgrims. Queen Elizabeth I was reigning in England. William Shakespeare was still writing. The Middle Ages had literally just come to an end. That's how far back 430 years is. For 430 years, Esau is growing as a nation, and Israel is not, because they're in Egypt. They're not making alliances with the nations around them. They're not building economic prosperity. They're not doing any of the things a nation would do. Think of what the United States has done in 250 years. What could Esau do as a nation in 430? And Israel didn't have that opportunity because they were in Egypt as slaves. After 430 years, Moses leads them out. And I'm giving you a summary of this history. But they head up to the promised land, back to Canaan, where they were supposed to be in the first place. Because of a setback in Numbers 14, they get turned around and have to wander for 40 years in the wilderness. But the second time, now after 40 years, they're coming back to the land. Guess what? The easiest way for them to get into the land this time, after 40 years, is to take the King's Highway north and come around the promised land from the east on the other side of the Jordan. There's a problem. The King's Highway runs directly through Edom. So they can't wander into Edom without permission. Well, now wait a minute. Didn't they wander through everybody's territory without permission and just destroy the nations as they went? Yeah, but they're not allowed to do that to the nation of Edom. I'm not going to make you flip there, but let me read to you in Deuteronomy chapter 2, as Moses recounts the law now to the next generation. Listen to what he says. This is chapter 2, verse 8 of Deuteronomy. Actually, let me start earlier than that. Verse 2. Yahweh spoke to me, saying, "You've circled this mountain long enough, turn north, and command the people, saying, you will pass through the territory of your brothers, the sons of Esau, who live in Seir, and they will be afraid of you, so be very careful, do not provoke them. For I will not give you any of their land, even a footstep, because I've given Mount Seir to Esau as a possession. You shall buy food from them with money so that you may eat. You shall purchase water from them with money so you may drink. The Lord your God's blessed you in everything. These 40 years I've been with you." Okay, so what happens? They're not allowed to pass through Edom. Edom won't let them. Esau comes against them and say, "If you even attempt it, we'll come out with our armies and slaughter you." And they are not allowed to fight back. God won't let them. So what's their option? They have to turn. They have to turn and go the long way around instead. And if you recount as you read through Numbers, the result of that was a plague of fiery serpents that killed thousands of them. So Esau was indirectly responsible for the death of thousands of Jews before they even got into their promised land. I mean, you see the problem between these two nations as it unfolds in history. So they end up in their promised land eventually, even though Edom was trying not to let them through. What happens? I'm going to summarize for you, and I gave you notes here, but this is on page 6 of your worship guide. Let me just quickly run through these, and we won't look at all the references tonight. I'll just summarize them for you, and then you got the references. If you're interested, you can look them up later, because I know you love to do that. You have nothing better to do than do my research for me. But here's the historical overview. They get into their land, okay? The first king of Israel, King Saul, beats them down. The text of 1 Samuel tells us that Edom was his enemy, and he inflicted punishment on them. That's 1 Samuel 14. So Saul, the first king of Israel, brings them under subjugation and makes them slaves. Then they're also subjugated again by the next king, David. So just within a few decades, David not only brings them into subjugation as Israel's slaves, but even puts military outposts in their territory. I mean, he puts his military bases on their land, okay? When Solomon, David's son, becomes king, here's what happened. When David brought Edom under subjugation, one of their royal family, his name was Hadad, he escaped. He fled. He went to Egypt, where David couldn't get to him. He probably would have stayed there forever and been happy. Pharaoh treated him very well. The problem is that God had other plans. Solomon was good when he became king. He was faithful, but then later in his reign, his heart turned away from God. And so the text tells us in 1 Kings that God raised up an enemy from him in Edom. He brought Hadad back from Egypt. And now Edom revolts against Solomon. Okay, that revolt continues through the next several kings. And about 50 years later, those Edomites joined an alliance of Moabites and Ammonites, and they attacked King Jehoshaphat. Now, the text in 2 Chronicles that tells us about that calls them the Maonites, but if you read the context, you see that this is the same people as the Edomites. If you remember when we studied the reign of King Jehoshaphat, we saw what happened with that crazy, huge army, that God turned them against themselves, and they defeated each other without any help from Jehoshaphat. Okay, so that's what happened as a result of that. They were defeated by Jehoshaphat. But then Jehoshaphat's son Jehoram was an awfully wicked king, and so they rebelled against him, and God allowed them to prevail, and they set up their own kingdom again, and now Edom is a nation in opposition to Israel again. What happens next? Well, I'm going to summarize it for you. The Nabateans eventually, remember that Assyria came in 722 and took the northern tribes into captivity. The Assyrians also attacked Edom. Then in 586, Babylon came and destroyed Judah. They also attacked Edom. So Edom was beset by the same enemies that Israel and Judah were. Then in about the 4th century BC, the Nabateans came and forced Edom out of its land. They forced the residents to leave the land. Where do they go? Palestine. They asked Brother Jacob, "Can we live with you?" And Brother Jacob said, "Sure." So they lived in southern Palestine. When the Romans conquered the area, they don't call them Edomites anymore. They call them Idumeans. Edom, it's the same people. You know a very famous Idumean, even if you don't know that you know him. Because when Jesus is born in Bethlehem in about 7 BC, an Idumean has been appointed by the Roman Empire as king over Judea. His name is Herod the Great. Why do you know him? Because he tried to execute Jesus when he was a baby. He went to Bethlehem and slaughtered all the male children. That is the ultimate act of aggression of the nation of Edom against Israel. You see, this struggle within the womb lasted until they were finally destroyed. Okay, so all of that is to say that is Edom and Jacob. That's where they started as twins in the womb, and that's where they ended up. Okay, now you might just be interested to know the Edomites no longer exist. Is there a nation of Edom you can go to today? No, there's not even a nation of Idumea. They don't exist. Their territory is now what we would call Jordan. Incidentally, that King's Highway that caused so much trouble to the nation of Israel as they came north still exists. It's not called the King's Highway anymore. It's Highway 35 and Highway 15 that runs north in Jordan, just in case you're interested, okay? So, well, let nobody say I don't do my homework. But anyway, so that's the nation. But you might be interested to know that some of the other Old Testament prophets, like Amos, Isaiah, make reference to a revived nation of Edom, a remnant of Edom that will exist in the millennial kingdom. So, some of them are alive somewhere today, and God will bring them back. I don't know where or when, but just be aware. It's interesting, okay? So, let's talk now. We've understood the hostility between these two nations, where it came from, where it started, where it led to, and why it was then that God brought down this judgment against Edom. Let's spend the rest of our time, however brief that may be, discussing what makes God think he has the right to bring judgment and destruction on anybody. Do you have that right? If somebody really makes you mad, if somebody aggresses against you, do you have the right to take justice into your own hands? Well, no. No, we don't. Right. I see her nodding over there, but remind me never to make her mad. That's all I'm saying, right? But you understand, we don't have that right as individuals. So why does God, also an individual, think he has that right? Okay, we're going to talk about what makes him qualified, and then we'll talk about what gives him the right. This is what makes him qualified. If the principles that Jesus lays out for us in his earthly ministry are any indication, in Matthew 7, as he gives the Sermon on the Mount, remember that Jesus says, "Why do you try to take the speck out of your brother's eye when there's a log in your own?" That principle is that I cannot see clearly to take the speck out of your eye, therefore I cannot judge righteously. I cannot judge with righteous judgment because I am inherently unrighteous in my very nature. So any judgment that I would propose to unleash on you would be an unrighteous judgment coming from an unrighteous place. In John chapter 8, this is a great story. You remember the woman who's caught in the very act of adultery, and as Jesus teaches there in the synagogue, in the temple, they drag this woman in front of him, in front of the entire crowd he's teaching, and they tell Jesus, "We caught this woman in the act of adultery. Now the law tells us that we should stone such women. What do you say?" And do you understand as you read the account that Jesus says, "Okay, stone her. I'll agree to that. So long as the first stone that gets thrown is thrown by the one among you that's not a sinner, then you can stone her." And of course, she doesn't end up getting stoned. They have to leave. Now, the principle is the same principle in Matthew 7. They all had logs in their eye. They realized, as Jesus pointed that out, they were not in a position to take the speck out of hers. They were just as guilty. Guilty people don't get to judge guilty people. That's just the way it is. If the judge that sits on the bench passes sentence against an offender, and then we find out later the judge was doing the same thing, guess what happens to the judge? He's in the same position, right? So the qualification to be allowed to judge is that you have to be righteous. Would anybody in the room want to argue with me if I just make the statement and not point it out from Scripture that God is righteous? He is inherently holy. He is perfectly righteous. Do I have to prove that from Scripture, or can we just accept that that's basic truth? God is, in his character, perfectly holy. He is perfectly righteous. Therefore, there is no log nor speck in his eye. So when it comes time to cast the stones, there is no sin in him. He gets to throw the stones. That's what makes him qualified as the judge. That's what Paul mentioned in chapter 3 of Romans. Can God who inflicts wrath be unrighteous? No, otherwise how will he judge the world? That's the argument that Paul was leveling for you there. So let's move on to the other point here, that if God is qualified to judge, what gives him the right to do it? Lots of people would be qualified to do a thing, but that doesn't give them the right to do it. For example, I might be qualified to what am I qualified to do? I'm qualified to preach, but that doesn't really matter. Let's say that I'm a mechanic and I have a license that says I'm a mechanic. Okay, I wish that were true. I got a car out there that needs some help. I'm a mechanic. I got a license that says I can practice. I'm qualified. I know what I'm doing. Does that give me the right to go across the street and work on the neighbor's car if he doesn't ask me to? Lots of people who are qualified don't have the right to do what they're qualified to do. God's qualified to judge. What gives him the right to do it? Okay, here it is. Not a person, not a thing, not an atom that exists in the entire universe stands on its own. Everything is owned. Everything has an owner. As you sit here, you ever heard that expression, you just got owned? As you sit here, you are owned. Humiliating, isn't it? I don't like the idea of it either, but it's a reality. Okay, so let me show you that from Scripture, because that one's a little bit harder to swallow. Where do I want to take you? Wait. Let me think. I want to take you to Isaiah. Where I want to take you is Isaiah. Come to Isaiah chapter 44. Genesis 1:1 tells us that in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. Okay, so let me ask you some questions based on what I just said. Who created? Go ahead. This is not a hypothetical question. Who created? Based on Genesis 1:1, who created? God. What did he create?
Heavens and the earth.
Right, he created everything. Okay, chapter 44 of Isaiah. Look at verse 22. That cannot be the right verse. Hang on. Isaiah 44. I don't know where it's at. Oh, it's verse 24. Isaiah 44:24, sorry. Okay. Thus says Yahweh your Redeemer, the one who formed you from the womb. I, Yahweh, am the maker of all things, stretching out the heavens by myself and spreading out the earth all alone. So not only is he the one that created, and not only is what he created everything that exists, he is the only one that created. There is no co-owner. There is no co-signer on this lease. He's it. So that means that as you sit here, the atoms that make up your body, the molecules, the cells, everything, they're not yours. You are borrowing them from their owner. They are not yours. They don't belong to you. Which inherently means what? You don't have the right to do with them as you choose. This is a hard truth. And I always like to throw stones at Walt Disney. But when he says follow your heart, he's a liar. You do not have the right to follow your heart. When I followed my heart, what happened? I destroyed people's lives. It's a fact. I don't have the right to do with this as I choose. It's not mine. I'm borrowing it. And as believers especially, who have placed our faith in Christ, we have been redeemed by a precious price. And Paul told the Corinthian church, you are not your own. You have been bought with a price. Therefore glorify God in your bodies. Okay. So that's the first principle. The physical part of this world, the physical part of everything that exists to the farthest star at the very edge of the farthest reaches of the universe, is all owned. It belongs to somebody, the one who created it. What about the internal part of me, the spirit? What about that? Does that belong? Is that owned too, or is that mine? Can I claim that one as mine? No, because in Genesis 2, when God makes man, how does he make man alive? There's a piece of clay right there that he's fashioned into the shape of a man. How does he make it alive? He gets down on his knees and breathes into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living spirit. Where'd that breath of life come from? It came out of God's mouth. He breathed it. It's his. Okay, now come to Ezekiel. You're in Isaiah. Flip past Isaiah, Jeremiah, Lamentations, Ezekiel, chapter 18. Chapter 18. And we've covered this verse in a couple of other studies as well. But let me just pick up in verse 4. Ezekiel 18:4. This is what God says. Behold, all souls are mine. The soul of the Father, as well as the soul of the Son, is mine. The soul who sins will die. Do you see that God intrinsically connects the idea of his right to judge with the fact that he is the owner? It belongs to him. The Spirit, every breath you take, it's not your air. It's not your air. You're borrowing it. It belongs. It's owned. Okay? So, I know this is a difficult concept, but we got to spend just a couple more minutes looking at this. So, you are in Ezekiel. I want you to flip back to the book right before it, Jeremiah. Okay, well, not Lamentations, but the book before that, Jeremiah. And we're also coming to chapter 18 of Jeremiah. Remember that Jeremiah prophesied to the nation of Judah as it's going into captivity and about to experience a brutal destruction. This is the captivity we talked about earlier, where women were eating their children and houses were being burned down. That's the destruction that Jeremiah is prophesying in the middle of. What gave God the right to do that? Who does he think he is? If I can say it that way, right? Who does God think he is that he has the right to make women so hungry and have no access to food that they have to eat their children? Why does God think he has the right to do that? I'm going to tell you right now. This is what God said to Jeremiah as he prophesied in the middle of that. Jeremiah chapter 18. Just follow, track carefully with me. The word which came to Jeremiah from Yahweh, saying, Arise, go down to the potter's house, and there I'll announce my words to you. Now this is unusual. Usually Jeremiah gets the word at his own house. But now Yahweh says, I want you to get up. I want you to go down the street. There's a potter working in his shop down there. I want you to go down there and watch him. And while you're watching him, then I'll explain something to you. So Jeremiah said, verse 3, Then I went down to the potter's house, and there he was, making something on the wheel. But the vessel that he was making of clay was spoiled in the hand of the potter. So he remade it into another vessel as it pleased the potter to make. And then the word of Yahweh came to me, saying, Can I not, O house of Israel, deal with you as this potter does? Declares Yahweh. Behold, like the clay in the potter's hand, so are you in my hand, O house of Israel. Is that just Israel? Listen to what God says to Jeremiah. At one moment I might speak concerning a nation, or concerning a kingdom, not just Israel, any of them, to uproot, to pull down, or to destroy it. But if that nation against which I've spoken turns from its evil, I'll relent concerning the calamity I plan to bring on it. Or at another moment I might speak concerning a nation or concerning a kingdom to build up or to plant it. But if it does evil in my sight by not obeying my voice, then I'll think better of the good with which I had promised to bless it. Well, how come God gets to just change his mind like that? You said you would bless me. You said you would. Now you're changing your mind. Why do you have the right to do that? Listen, you don't get to ask those kind of questions. That not only reveals arrogance, it reveals ignorance. You are nothing but a lump of clay. God has the right to do with you as the potter does with a lump of clay. That's harsh truth. I said earlier, it's not just humbling, it's humiliating. Because we live in a society where I want to be a self-made man and I want to work for what I get and I want to be able to hold my head up and I want to be able to walk with a straight back as I walk down the street. Guess what? Paul says, if I have to boast about anything, I will boast in my weakness, because in my weakness, God's power is made strong. Let me tell you something as I sit here. I've made no bones about this. I am a broken man. I have hurt people. I have done terrible things. There are times, even now, all these years later, that I weep in my bed as I think about it. That's not even an exaggeration. It's the truth. I'm a broken man. We are, as we sit here, broken people. The beautiful thing is that God has promised mercy to broken vessels. And just like the potter has the right to tear down a vessel if it doesn't do what he wants, he has the right to take a broken vessel and mend it. He can do that too. He has that right. And he has that power. That's the point of the Ephesians passage that we've been looking at, that hyper mega dynamite power in resurrecting dead things. Okay, so what now? Romans chapter 9, as Paul unfolds his doctrine of the election of national Israel as opposed to Edom specifically, he brings up this passage. He brings up the passage about Jacob and Esau that we read in Isaiah 25, in Genesis 25. And he relates all these passages to this. Well, you turn there. I might as well turn there too. I was just going to summarize it for you. But in chapter 9 of Romans, look at verse 10. Not only this, there was Rebekah also, when she conceived twins by one man, our father Isaac, though the twins were not yet born and had not done anything good or bad, so that God's purpose according to his choice would stand, not because of works, but because of him who calls. It was said to her, the older will serve the younger. Just as it is written, Jacob I loved, but Esau I hated. Well, what then? Is there any injustice with God? That doesn't seem fair to me. And Paul's answer is make a noise. There it is again. That thought is inconceivable. So verse 19, we'll just skip down here. You will say to me then, why does God still find fault? Because who resists his will? And Paul's answer to that is, on the contrary, who are you, O man, that answers back to God? The thing molded will not say to the molder, why did you make me like this, will it? Or does not the potter have a right over the clay to make from one lump a vessel for honorable use and another for common use? God has the right, doesn't he? He has the right over the clay. As you sit here, you are owned. You are a piece of clay. God has the right to do with you as he sees fit. I'm sorry if that grates against your pride. It grates against mine too, but I didn't say it. God did, and he said it repeatedly. Okay? He didn't say it to humiliate you. He said it to make sure you understand that retributive justice is a fact. It is as inevitable as gravity. And at the end of your life, you are going to stand before him and you're going to have to answer. And I do not want to have to stand before him and answer without Jesus at my side to answer for me. And frankly, I'm terrified of the thought that any of you might have to stand in that position too. That's why I'm here. Okay. Come back to Isaiah 66, the last chapter of the book of Isaiah, and we'll look at a couple quick verses in Isaiah, and then we'll be done. So what? So how does all of this retributive justice and God's right to unleash wrath and judgment, his right as the potter over the clay, what does that have to do with you as you sit here? Well, you have a choice in how you relate to this truth and how you relate to this God. You can stiffen your neck under it. You can harden your heart against it. You can't change the reality of it, but you can certainly change how you respond to it. But look in chapter 66 of Isaiah. Let me start in verse 1. And you will see again God's right to do with things as he chose because he's the creator. Thus says Yahweh, Isaiah 66 verse 1, thus says Yahweh, heaven is my throne, the earth is my footstool. Where then is a house you could build for me? Where's a place that I may rest? For my hand made all these things, and thus all these things came into being. But to this one I will look, to him who is humble and contrite of spirit, and who trembles at my word. So you do have a choice in how you respond to that truth. You can stiffen your neck, you can be hard-hearted, you can rebel against it. You can't change the inevitability of it. Absolutely as inevitable as the tide. But the promise is, if you don't stiffen your neck, if you don't harden your heart, God has promised to look upon those who are humble, contrite of spirit, and who tremble at his word. Come back to chapter 64, and let me read the passage to you, and then let's just make this our prayer, right? This is how we want to respond in our hearts toward God. After Isaiah has promised judgment coming down on the northern 10 tribes, listen to what he says. Oh, that you would rend the heavens and come down, that the mountains might quake at your presence, as fire kindles the brushwood, as fire causes water to boil, to make your name known to your adversaries, that the nations may tremble at your presence. When you did awesome things which we did not expect, you came down, the mountains quaked at your presence. For from days of old they have not heard or perceived by ear, nor has the eye seen a God besides you, who acts in behalf of the one who waits for him. You meet him who rejoices in doing righteousness, who remembers you in your ways. Behold, you were angry, for we sinned. We continued in them a long time, and shall we be saved? For all of us have become like one who is unclean, and all of our righteous deeds are like a filthy garment. All of us wither like a leaf, and our iniquities, like the wind, take us away. There's no one who calls on your name, who arouses himself to take hold of you, for you've hidden your face from us and have delivered us into the power of our iniquities. But now, O Yahweh, you are our Father. We are the clay, you our potter, and all of us are the work of your hand. Do not be angry beyond measure, O Yahweh, nor remember iniquity forever. Behold, look now. All of us are your people. What a beautiful prayer that is. What a beautiful prayer that is. And I really do hope that that's not just words on a page as I read them to you. I really do hope that's the cry of your heart. We recognize that we are sinners at heart. To the core of us, we are rebellious against God and we're destructive to each other. It just is what we are. The penalty for that kind of treason before a holy God is death. There can be no other penalty. It's death. And yet God has sent his own Son in human flesh to pay the death penalty for you. All you have to do is turn. Turn your face back to God and away from all the things that entice you. Turn your face back to the one who makes the offer to look upon those who are contrite in heart. And then retributive justice is no longer a reality for you because you get mercy instead of justice. Praise God for mercy.